So welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have these presenters here today. We are here for another webinar in the seminar series. This has been such a great and successful perk of being a member of the System Dynamics Society. And we are here today from presenters from Climate Interactive, Millennium Institute, and the Climate Change Initiative from University of Massachusetts Lowell. And they're going to talk about the system dynamics for climate change mitigation. And I really hope that by the end of this webinar, you learn a little bit more of the EN road simulator. Millennium Institute, they're going to share a little bit about successful projects from them and what are they doing with their tool. And the CCI also going to share some information of how they're using system dynamics to raise awareness of climate change. So every time we get a new seminar, we start promoting, we start getting new members to the society. So which is really a great perk of being a member. And for those who are first, newcomers here, welcome really. We get a new expanding the system dynamics field through these webinars. And this is not only the only benefit of being a member, you also get a great discount at a conference that is only 2 weeks far. And we also you can also get full access to the scientific journal, the System Dynamics Review, exclusive prices on our bookshop, free access to our networking series. So you're planning to meet more people. Being a member is probably the best way you can do to meet people in the field. You also get access to a pool of mentors. You can get one-on-one coaching on system dynamics and really great opportunity to learn more about the approach. And our conference, as I said, is just a few weeks away. 126 panel papers. We have top-notch workshops, 27 of them. It's a great opportunity also to networking, and we also having a career fair, so you get to know a few companies and other organizations working on system dynamics, maybe learn more about their open opportunities and apply for a new job. The conference, if you haven't registered yet, happens from July 25 to 30, and you can register now at systemdynamics.org/conference. And if you enjoy the seminar series, we have an upcoming webinar on August 18th. This is going to be an introduction to modeling process with a model of Romeo and Juliette. This is a free webinar, so you can also invite the friends who always wanted to learn a little bit of system dynamics and learn a little bit more of what you always mentioning, system dynamics to everyone. This is going to be with Nikki Zimmerman. She's here today with us from the University College London. And if you haven't registered yet for the conference warm-up, this is going to be a live social event where you can race against people who join us the Saturday before the conference, so Saturday, July 24 at 10 a.m. New York. And we're also doing a raffle, so every $30 you donate, you get a chance to win a free 2022 society membership. And I just want to give a shout out to our sponsors. It's only through their help we're being able to continue expand the system dynamics field. And if you want to become a sponsor of the society, you can reach out to me or Rebecca at office@systemdynamics.org. And a quick agenda for today. We're going to have about 60 minutes, maybe less, of presentation. We're going to start with Climate Interactive, followed by Millennium Institute, and then the CCI. And we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A. It's usual Q&A that we have. We're going to use, again, Poll Everywhere for a Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and give you 30 seconds, 1 minute to join us on Poll Everywhere. You can choose by scanning this QR code on your screen, or there's going to be a link in the chat. So you can also click there and join us, or you can type yourself pollev.com/STSPulse877. There's 3 ways to get there, and I hope you get in there soon. And I just have one question for you guys, actually 2. This is the first one. and it's where are you joining us from? We usually have people from all over the world, and today is no difference. I see people from London, Mexico, Germany, the Netherlands, a lot of people from Europe, the US, of course, South America. I see Argentina here, Ireland, Cambridge, Albania. Wow, everywhere. This is truly great. It really shows the diversity of our community. This is one of my favorite things of being part of the System Dynamics Society. And talking a little bit more about the conference, if this goes to the next one. Yeah. And I really would like to know, what are you most excited about for the conference this year? Maybe try to use 1 or 2 words so we can see. I have to click it somewhere. This is from the other one. Seeing friends, of course, this is really, truly great. I'm really excited to the plenary sessions, getting to know a little bit more of the donut economics, the work that John Sterman did for COVID. So I'm really excited to attend those. Learning more, of course, see models, catch up and learn, sustainability. There's thread on environment, so you can join those sessions there. So yeah, people really looking forward to learn. So of course, the conference is such a great opportunity to learn. I see you guys learn how to use the poll everywhere. So the Q&A, it's going to be open for you guys to share send your questions throughout the presentation, and the presenters are going to address them by the end. Okay, thank you so much.
Y ya hicimos una actividad.
Can I just remind you guys to close your microphones, mute your microphones? Thank you. I'm almost done. It's a little bit slow. Sorry. Open again. Present. So I'm really happy to introduce you for these 4 wonderful presenters today. Sibel Eker, she's a senior researcher at the Climate Interactive. And we have Steve Arquitt from the Millennium Institute. He's a senior research analyst, and he's also leading the efforts of our Millennium Institute in Asia. Juliette Rooney-Varga, she's the director of the Climate Change Initiative at UMass Lowell. And we also have Carolyn McCarthy, which is a friend of mine. She's a program associate at the CCI. So I'm taking no more time from you guys. Sibel is starting. Sibel, if you want to take over and share your screen, do so now. Thank you so much for joining us today here.
Thanks, Fernando. Yep, I guess you can see my screen now. Hello, everyone. My name is Sibel Eker. I'm a senior researcher at Climate Interactive and a research scholar at International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. So I guess, as far as I know, System Dynamics community is quite familiar with the tools and models Climate Interactive is developing. Our co-director, Drew Jones, was here at this webinar series, for example, a few weeks ago. He gave a wonderful presentation about how to engage people using interactive simulation environments. So my talk will be addition to that, and it will be mostly about the role these tools play, these system dynamics models and interactive simulation environments play in global change modeling for climate change research and actions. And I also heard that there is some curiosity about what's going on behind the scenes, more the technical aspects of the model development. So I will also say a few words about this at the end of my talk. So let me start with global modeling. System dynamics, first of all, has actually played a pioneering role in global change modeling. World Dynamics of J. Forrester was a seminal work, and the limits to growth which is based on world dynamics, has been a highly influential study when it was published in 1973. So it was one of the first studies who focused on the feedbacks between the socioeconomic and environmental systems, and who projected future problems, future difficulties about sustainability. I think the book was sold millions of copies in 30 different languages, and I personally know that at that time it was even in the bookshelves of engineers who work at Shell, one of the biggest fossil fuel companies. So it created a huge awareness in terms of upcoming sustainability problems. However, there was also a lot of criticism to world dynamics in particular, and to system dynamics modeling in general. So this is a large block quote from an old study published in System Dynamics Review by Yaman Barlas. I obviously do not expect you to read it, but let me summarize the criticism described here. So one scientist who is covered with red tape here at the moment was one of the strongest critiques of world dynamics and system dynamics. And the main argument was that none of the relationships included in the model was drawn from empirical studies. So the methodology and the model lacked empirical relationships and empirical evidence heavily. So of course, Jay Forrester wrote replies to this criticism. I know that Dana Meadows wrote replies, and it was back and forth, and I think it would have been a very interesting scientific discussion to follow if I existed at that time. This person that I covered with red tape and who criticized world dynamics at that time was William Nordhaus, who later developed his own model of global model of climate and economy, and even won a Nobel Prize with it in 2018. The model William Nordhaus developed, the DICE model, was widely used in science, in research, and also in policymaking. But more importantly, the logic behind it, the equilibrium of supply and demand in the energy market, and the resulting emissions, resulting energy mix, and the emissions and their effects on climate, has led to development of many, many more models, which are now known as integrated assessment models. Integrated assessment models are simply models that capture the interactions between climate, economy, and environment, and gives us different pathways for emissions as well as mitigation options to reduce these emissions. Integrated assessment models are very popular and very useful those days, mostly because the role they played in the last few decades in climate change negotiations and solutions. They heavily influenced the target setting and agenda setting in the UN climate change negotiations, for example. However, there are many integrated assessment models around. They are used for different purposes, but there are also many critiques of IIMs, which you can find either in the scientific literature or in the public debate in media, different media outlets, for example. So I will list some of these criticisms in my aggregation and in my perspective. The first is that IIMs are not accessible to many people, and they are not usable by non-experts. You really need to be an expert to be able to run this model, understand the conceptualization behind it, and create your own scenarios. In addition to that, they are not transparent, so people do not really know what's going on behind it and what are the assumptions. There is a lot of work done in the last couple of years to address these limitations. There are open access, open source packages, for example, where you can explore these scenarios and even run some simulations by yourself. However, they still require a significant expert knowledge. Also, these models are criticized for focusing on economic feedbacks primarily, excluding the relationships between human and earth systems. They are also criticized for being socially and politically infeasible. So they have their own assumptions, they create some scenarios, but if you take a step back and look at what these scenarios mean, they are often implausible or infeasible. This is sometimes because of the narrow range of uncertainties considered in them. And it's not only conceptually, but also technically, the models do not allow covering a wide range of uncertainties and running scenarios with a wide range of uncertainties. So as a response to these criticisms, different groups are advocating for simple models to complement these complex, large integrated assessment models. And one of these is Climate Interactive. This diagram you see here was developed by Drew Jones and Beth Savin, as far as I remember, and we use it often at Climate Interactive. It basically says that complex models, this could be IAMs I mentioned, or they can be general circulation models on the climate science. These models are superior in terms of the detail and scope. However, they lack the speed, simplicity, and transparency of simple models like En-ROADS and C-ROADS, for example, developed by Climate Interactive. Therefore, while simple models can benefit from the complex models, for example, in terms of quantification or cross-validation, simple models can help to improve, can help to complement complex models to address the limitations that I listed a few minutes ago. So if I repeat it one more time, simple models like our En-ROADS, for example, is accessible and usable by non-experts. They, through stakeholder participation, through engaging different groups of people, different stakeholders, they allow creating plausible and feasible scenarios, because we take different perspectives, and especially expert or stakeholder perspectives into account, and that allows developing plausible and feasible scenarios. Because of the scope, speed, and accessibility, it allows covering a wide range of uncertainties, if we would like to run that kind of analysis. Also, the scope and the modeling approach we have behind it, system dynamics, allows integrating many more feedbacks and nonlinearities that we have in real life between the human and Earth systems. Therefore, there is really merit in using simple models. This is how En-ROADS serves to this purpose. And in this diagram, you see an overview of En-ROADS and the components of En-ROADS. I wanted to go through this because I wanted to say more concrete things about what an integrated assessment model is, what kind of systems it allows us to analyze and integrate. So in En-ROADS, for example, when you pull the sliders, there are different sliders referring to actions in different areas of the energy system or emissions. But in the baseline, without pulling any sliders, these dynamics are driven by socioeconomic factors like GDP per capita or population. Then they go and drive the energy demand, and we model the energy market, the demand side and supply side of the energy market through a market clearing mechanism. So I think the difference here from the logic I mentioned earlier is being process-based and describing the mechanisms rather than simply assuming that there is a general equilibrium between supply and demand. These dynamics in the energy market go and drive the emissions, and based on these emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, we have the climate impacts. So in the last couple of years, the model was mostly focused on the energy market, demand and supply, which comes from the earlier work of John Storman and Tom Fiedemann, as far as I know, also the climate system and the climate feedbacks. In addition to that, we recently added a feedback from climate impacts to economy. This allows us actually to explore real life dynamics and to talk about money. And there is also lots of extensions on the way to explore the nature-based solutions, land-based solutions and the food systems. These extensions are important because they take our discussion beyond climate change and helps us, gives us the ability, gives us the capacity to explore different dimensions of sustainability, such as food security or biodiversity, like referring to the sustainable development goals like life on land and life in water. So you might have heard of multi-solving, which is one of the core concepts developed and used in Climate Interactive. With these additions, we will actually also be able to address the multi-solving aspect more explicitly. Another thing I would like you to notice in this diagram is the process-based structure En-ROADS has. I'm emphasizing this because I would like to refer to the 50 years old criticism of William Nordhaus. This model is process-based, which means that the elements in the model correspond to indicators and measures that exist in real life. Therefore, they are quantified with empirical relationships and empirical with latest recent empirical evidence. One of the examples I really like is this update we recently had on En-ROADS. You might know that renewable energy costs have substantially declined in the last couple of decades. It was like the cost has declined by 82% in the last 10 years, if I remember correctly. And especially solar photovoltaics are expected to have the highest increase in the generation capacity in the coming decades by 2050. This is mostly due to, as I mentioned, due to the reduction in the cost. And if we look at scenarios generated by IIMs published in the IPCC reports, they lack they are not able to capture this decline in the solar photovoltaic cost. Therefore, the share they allocate to renewable energy in the future scenarios is very limited. There is quite a wide uncertainty there. With En-ROADS, we were able to, especially with Laurie's work, with very quick work, we were able to update the model in a few months after doing all the analysis. And we were able to bring the cost values in the model to what is actually observed. That means that with the capacity we have using a system dynamics model, using a different approach, we are able to follow empirical data even better than large integrated assessment models. I want to spend very few minutes about the technical aspects of this model development, because I heard that people wanted me to talk about what's going on behind the scenes. So I will say very, very basically that we have three main components in the model development process. So like many system dynamics modelers, we start modeling on a commercial software. Particularly, we use Vensim by Ventana Systems. We do all the model development there, but then we have an in-house software called SD Everywhere, which translates Vensim models to C code. And then this more primitive computer code is translated to another programming language, another computer code, so that we can use it, we can make an online app. So for people who are interested in these technical aspects, I can also say that SD Everywhere converts it to C, and then C is converted to WebAssembly language that can be integrated to JavaScript and browsers. That's how En-ROADS run on browsers. One thing I want to mention is the speed of this in-house software we have, because many things we do on En-ROADS takes much longer. Simulations take much longer if we run it on the commercial software. However, they are shorter than a blink of eye in the online interface. For example, we recently added a feature that calculates social cost of carbon. This is a bit complicated because anytime you change the assumptions and calculate the social cost of carbon, there is actually two model simulations in the background, and they are much longer than usual. normally our time horizon is through 2100, but these new simulations in the background are until 2300. So on my local computer, which is a pretty standard computer, that for me, this two runs, but sorry, only one of the runs takes, let's say 4 seconds, but in the simulator, this is instantaneous. Another thing I want to say about the technical aspects is the co-development and continuous integration of model parts developed by different people. So this collaboration in model development was new to me, and it may be new to many people who do system dynamics modeling. But this is, again, thanks to the software architecture we developed, in-house software architecture, and other common tools available to software developers such as GitHub. Another thing I wanted to mention about the technical aspects is the model testing required for this continuous integration. This is again an in-house software that my colleague Chris Campbell has been developing. And simply it allows us to compare the new features, the new models to the existing models every time we integrate a new model to the existing one. Every one we integrate an extension to the existing model. So, and this means that I don't want to go into detail, but this means that it is actually very hard to put garbage into this model because it gets an automated instantaneous test, and it allows us to control this continuous integration made by different people. Shortly speaking, it is a way we had to develop for collaboration on a system dynamics model with a relatively large team. Normally, a system dynamics modeling process is conducted by one single modeler, for example. But when there are many people working on a single model, we need that kind of infrastructure. So we are happy to answer more questions if you are curious about these technical aspects, but I will stop here. We recently launched a training program. If you would like to learn about En-ROADS, and if you would like to learn how to facilitate events using En-ROADS, you can go to learn.climateinteractive.org. For now, thank you very much for listening, and I will hear if you have questions.
Thank you, Sibel. Now ask Steve to start sharing his screen. And need to find him here.
How was that? Can you see okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. About 15 minutes, is that, that works?
Yeah, it works.
Okay. Well, hello everyone, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to you. First of all, I'd like to thank Fernando and Rebecca and the System Dynamics Society for giving me this chance to share some of our work at the Millennium Institute on the SDGs. It's an honor to be here with you. My talk will be about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and a model developed by the Millennium Institute to serve as a planning tool for the SDGs. Climate change is a part of the SDGs, I believe the most important part, but it won't be the central focus of my talk. We pretty much live and breathe SDGs at the Millennium Institute, but that doesn't mean that everyone is so familiar. So I'll give first some background on the SDGs, then give a glimpse of the iSDG model. And Fernando has asked me to talk about how the iSDG model has influenced decision-making. So I'll take a stab at that by describing some of the SDG work in Malawi that I was involved with. Okay, sorry. So what are the SDGs? And here's a description from the UN, and you see it's pretty comprehensive. It's a very lofty vision, an inspirational kind of vision. But there are 17 SDGs that cover environmental, social, and economic domains, and 169 UN-sanctioned targets dispersed among the SDGs. And at the latest count, 231 official indicators. The goals and targets are non-binding. It's up to each country to find their own path to the SDGs. The SDG period is from 2015 to 2030. And almost every country in the world has signed on to the SDGs and at least nominally have adopted them. Now, from the onset, it was recognized that the SDGs are interlinked and, dynamic. This diagram was made by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs to show how many of the SDG targets overlap between the SDGs. And this leads to one of the guiding principles that the UN, one of the UN's guiding principles on the SDGs. And you note here that the keywords are integration and interlinkages. So the UN recognizes that the SDGs are integrated and they're calling for integrated solutions to address the SDGs. And this is where the Millennium Institute makes its contribution. Now, the Millennium Institute has been, developing integrated models for more than 30 years. And these models are known as the Threshold 21 models, or T21 models for short. And some of the applications have been sustainable agriculture, green economy, the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the SDGs, and now the SDGs. So we've applied the T21 modeling framework that's been developed over the years to the SDGs, but of course, there are many changes that have been made to the model. Up to this point, we've used this model probably in about 20 different countries, mostly developing countries. And here's a high-level picture of the iSDG model. There are 30 submodels or subsectors conceptually organized into economic, social, and environmental dimensions. Now, this is quite an incomprehensible pile of spaghetti. I'll show you this to demonstrate that the model is very interlinked and integrated as called for by the UN. This is the interface of the iSDG, and the model includes all 17 SDGs, uses about 78 targets, and this varies depending on the country application. I should point out that the iSDG is customized for each country of application. Each SDG icon you see here is a button that takes the user to a suite of policies. And these policies, again, will vary from country to country. Here I've gone to SDG 7 to select interventions relevant to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Note that the entries can extend across the SDG time horizon and are in terms of % of GDP, although you can also enter absolute amounts. Most, but not all, the policies under the icons are expenditure interventions. The idea is that the user interface is as friendly as possible to be used in a facilitated group setting, allowing users to get a better understanding of the impacts of multiple and simultaneous interventions on SDG performance. The simulation just takes a couple of seconds and then returns the user to the user interface. And now you see two sets of bars next to each icon. The blue one is the SDG attainment at year 2030, which is the last year of the SDG time horizon, under business as usual conditions. The red bar shows performance under the policy mix. And for this simulation, I also made interventions under SDG 2, that's in sustainable agriculture, under 11 in the transportation sector, and under 12 in large scale solar and hydro. Note that SDG 13 is not much changed. This is because the greenhouse gas emissions has not been an SDG indicator, oddly enough. However, this is just recently changed And the greenhouse gas emissions is now an official UN indicator for SDG 13. So this model, when it's updated, would show a response under SDG 13 to those policies for greenhouse gas emissions. And here you see the interventions, the impact of the interventions on one of the targets for SDG 7, that's the proportion of electricity from renewable sources. It looks like a large jump, but in fact, the scale on the y-axis adjusts, so it's not as dramatic as one would think at first glance. And the simple diagram here shows that shows the user some of the important linkages from the interventions to other variables. Here's a graph showing the influence of combined policies on the CO2 equivalent emissions. By the way, with this model, similar to the En-ROADS model, there are no silver bullets. So we always examine combinations of policies to try to arrive at a good SDG performance in the simulations. But of course, there's little value in the model without a modeling process that engages users. And this diagram shows a few of the stages in that process. Initially, a modeling team is formed. And throughout this spiral that you see, the team undergoes training in systems thinking and system dynamics, as well as the iSDG and the user interface of the iSDG. And workshops are held in country. These are now being held remotely because of the pandemic, which presents its own challenges. But the workshops are held to introduce the structure and assumption of the modeling, of the model to the modeling team, and representatives from various ministries to give them the opportunity to comment on and potentially suggest changes to the model. Later, workshops will be held to identify policies to simulate and new sectors to add to the model. And then a facilitated scenario workshop for running the model and trying to identify effective policy combinations. But now I'll turn to Malawi and Fernando's question about how the model supported decision-making, which in this instance means planning. The purpose of this project was to prioritize and incorporate the SDGs into the national planning in Malawi, with particular reference to the Malawi Growth and Development Plan 3. That's a 5-year national plan. Partners with the government of Malawi, that's actually the National Planning Commission of the Malawi government, the UNDP, University of Malawi, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the Millennium Institute. Now, to have any chance of actually helping decision-making, a lot of groundwork had to be laid. First, as I mentioned earlier, a modeling team was assembled, and straight off, the team started working on obtaining data, locating important documents, literature, this sort of thing. Capacity building for the team began early on and took the form of hands-on trainings and system dynamics, systems thinking, the iSDG structure and the user interface. And the team also took an online course in SD. So there was a heavy investment in capacity building. Then the interactions that included not just the modeling team, but people from different ministries, NGOs, civil society. And these workshops included model review, as I mentioned, mapping government policies to SDG targets to inform the development of model, SDG target setting, and scenario analyses. So the activities of the team and the capacity building and the workshop activities were essential to developing a useful model, and were also intended to build a spirit of ownership. Well, I wanted to find some words written by partners, particularly the Malawi government, about how they perceive the model helped in the national planning process. And this is something taken from the strategy itself, and they identified 5 key areas for the plan, for the national plan, and that was facilitated by using the iSDG. Also, the iSDG helped to align the KPAs, that's the key performance areas, to SDGs, and help prioritize SDGs for Malawi. So that was positive. And also they mentioned that the iSDG simulations confirmed the implementation of the KPAs would impact the SDGs. But the documents don't really say how these things happened. And I think it was probably through the project report, which was written jointly with members of the modeling team in Malawi, is the source of those ideas that are embedded in the national plan. And the next document was a so-called SDG audit done by UNDP of the National Development Plan. And it brought out some highlights that I thought were interesting. One, they mentioned allocative efficiency rather than just an increase in resources to achieve the SDGs. So that was a high priority to find mixes of policies that were synergetic, that would yield results and also at the same time potentially save cost. They mention highlights of interconnectivity between policies and SDG indicators, that specifically investments in agriculture can influence other SDGs either indirectly or through interconnectedness with the goals. And also, they mentioned that the ISD stresses that the SDG 1 and 2 are strongly affected by SDG 16, that's governance. And that is a high priority with the UNDP. And again, I think probably most of these ideas in this report were gleaned from the project report itself. And UNDP was a very active partner in this project and also assisted in the project report. But reflecting over all of this, there are some concerns that I have. And one is that what's written in plans and is not necessarily what's actually done in the real world. So I don't really have an answer to that problem. And if anybody out there does, I would love to hear it. But perhaps follow-ups after a project has been completed could help motivate some real world implementation. Also, the national planning horizon in Malawi is 5 years, and the SDG period extends for 15 years in total. So here, hopefully, with the next 5-year iteration of planning, perhaps we can get involved to learn from what we've done and to continue on with the SDG policies. Also, there was, I think, a lack of engagement with the upper echelon of decision making. We worked with the National Planning Council and our Planning Commission, and that's part of the Ministry of Finance. But as far as reaching the people that are at the close to the top who really make the decisions, I didn't really shake any of those hands. And perhaps an idea to get around that would be to hold webinars to find out who is approachable, offer webinars, presentations on this approach to further sell it to the highest levels. And then of course, COVID-19, and I've been told by the team just recently that COVID, of course, has been a real game changer. And there, it will be interesting to be able to revamp the model to try to capture some of the COVID impacts and points and find some areas of non-resiliency and then adjust policies to try build back better principle. On the more encouraging side, we've had continuing support from the UNDP, and it's led to projects in other countries. The capacity that we worked on is still there, and hopefully the trainings have planted some seeds that might lead to further use of systems thinking or SD for other problems. And recently we've been contacted by the National Planning Commission in Malawi about revising this model for application to the Africa Agenda 2063. So it's possible this work will live on beyond the scope of the SDG project itself. So thank you. And if any of you are interested in collaborating on SDGs, I'd love to hear from you. And later on, I think we'll have time to entertain any questions if you have any. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. There are some questions we can answer after Juliette's presentation.
Okay.
Juliette, let me find you.
Yeah.
Like, you can go ahead and take over the screen share.
Great. Okay. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you. This is great to have an opportunity to speak to this group and also to follow such great presentations. Definitely relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So thank you also, Sibel and Steve. So I'm co-presenting today with Carolyn McCarthy. So I'm assuming that you'll be able to see us both. We're just going to start off with talking about a little bit about some of the role play simulations that are actually built around En-ROADS and another model, C-ROADS, that Sibel spoke about, and share some research that we've done about the impact that these simulations have on participants, and we hope decision-making and action in the real world. So that connects also to what Steve was mentioning a moment ago about how can we kind of move from modeling to action. And I'll just hand it over to Carolyn, who's going to give you also a little bit of an introduction about how we also use system dynamics and systems thinking as a way to, really organize ourselves and our initiative, the climate change initiative at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell.
All right, thank you, Juliette. So as Juliette said, my name is Carolyn McCarthy, and I am a program associate at the Climate Change Initiative. So the Climate Change Initiative is a group of about 35 faculty members, staff, and student leaders at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and we span about 13 different academic departments in 6 different colleges. So we have folks who are coming from the sciences, from the humanities, engineering, and arts. And what we all have in common is that we all share a commitment to addressing climate change and sustainability in diverse ways, including through our research, through our teaching, and through community engagement. So our faculty together teach about 1/3 of students on the UML campus, including serving as advising roles for research. Our members historically have been engaged in the development of UMass Lowell's Climate Action Plan and are currently represented on the Green Community Partnership, which is a formal partnership between the university and the city of Lowell. And in terms of our research and academic interests, our faculty include lead authors for the International Panel on Climate Change, who focus on extreme weather events and look at the economic and social implications of climate change, as well as how public art can be integrated into climate change communication and education. And as Juliette mentioned, aside from our research that we conduct directly involving system dynamics, we also use systems thinking for organizational strategic planning, which allows us to bring people together across different disciplines. We also use CLDs in our workshops with policymakers at institutional, city, and state levels to support decision-making. But in terms of what we're going to focus on today, we're going to look at our work in collaboration with partners in the SD space, so namely Climate Interactive, who you heard from earlier, and the MIT Sustainability Initiative. And so our role in this work is that we contribute to model development, so especially in the bioenergy sector of the En-ROADS model. We co-develop the role-playing simulations that accompany these models, and then we also research the impact of these simulations on climate change beliefs, attitudes, and actions. And so what we ask, a common question across all of our research is, what kinds of tools are most effective in moving people to make evidence-based action on climate? And what we found is that while rigorous and accessible system dynamics models of complex physical systems are important for delivering insights, somewhat to what Stephen alluded to, it's not always enough. What we have in the plans are not necessarily what we see in the real world. And so what some of our research has shown is that creating experiences that combine these interactive SD models with engaging experiences that immerse people in the complex social systems have an impact, because they allow people to learn, feel, and take action for themselves. And so before Juliette jumps into our research on these impacts, you might be asking, well, what does a combined role play and simulation model experience look like in the field of climate change? So I'll tell you a little bit about two of our simulations here. So Sibel spoke earlier about the En-ROADS model. There is an entire role play event that facilitates group interactions with these models, as well as an earlier model called C-ROADS. And those two simulations are called the World Climate Simulation and the Climate Action Simulation. And these two simulations are similar in many ways. So they are both very engaging, highly interactive, even in an online format. They require participants to deliberate in groups and make speeches and negotiate with other teams. The facilitation materials are free and available for anyone to use. And in both simulations, participants take on the role of policymakers and leaders who are charged with negotiating a global agreement to address climate change.
Yeah, and just thinking about this audience too, I wanted to mention that we would love to take questions as we're going. The more interactive, the better. We didn't have a chance to integrate the Poll Everywhere into our slides this time, that the Poll Everywhere account from the SD Society. But one question that I would have, maybe Fernando could put in the Poll Everywhere system, is how many of you have played one of these simulations or participated in one of them? Because I'm guessing that we've got quite a few people who have. So that would be fun to know.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Juliette. So briefly, the first simulation is the World Climate Simulation. And this focuses really on the scale and urgency of action that leaders of national governments must take in order to reach our international climate goals. So you may be representing or playing in your role the president of the US or of China, and participants make public speeches where they pledge to reduce emissions and deforestation and also contribute financially to the Green Climate Fund to aid the world's most vulnerable nations. And then the Climate Action Simulation around the En-ROADS model focuses on specific climate solutions and their impacts and multiple benefits when implemented on a global scale. So in this simulation, participants are divided into teams that represent different global stakeholders in business, government, and civil society who can drive climate solutions in the real world. And through debate and their discussions, they will create a scenario of their unique combination of climate solutions. There is no silver bullet to reach these international climate goals. And of course, during both of these simulations, these decisions that participants make are entered directly into the C-ROADS or the En-ROADS models so that they can get real-time feedback on the expected climate outcomes of their decisions. And the simulations end after multiple rounds of negotiations when the groups have reached their shared goal or when they run out of time. So now that you have a better idea of some of the simulation tools we are talking about, I'll pass it off to Juliette, who will tell you more about our latest research looking at the impacts of these tools.
Yeah, and as I get started, one thing is really want to make sure that we acknowledge many people who are involved in this research, from Carolyn, of course, Ken Rath, Karen McNeil, Nicole Northfuss, Maggie Hensel, John Storman, and others. So this is from a larger team. I also just want to mention that, again, connecting back to what Steve was saying, and also really connecting back to how Sibel kicked us off with limits to growth and world dynamics, that we often, I think, are finding ourselves asking this question of how we have these models. They're amazing. They really give us incredible insights about how the world works, about how we might achieve a future that we would like to see. And yet our efforts often fall flat, right? We often don't seem to manage to translate the ideal scenarios in those models into real world action. And I think that's something that we're really interested in. I cannot claim that we're anywhere close to having that question sorted out, but I do think that we have to think about so certainly, as Steve mentioned, reaching people who have real decision-making power, those in the highest places of policymaking and decision makers in private and other spheres, but also to, in our theory of change, at least, to reach as many people as possible so that those who are leading, those who are holding government offices, for example, can have the political space to make those decisions. So social movements and social political support for those kinds of decisions we think is really important. So one of our questions is, how can we reach many people? That's a talk for another day, but also how can we move, all of the people that we're reaching to action? And that's what I'm going to start off today. So I think a key motivator for all of us here today is, and certainly for our recent work, is what I think of as a story of 3 gaps. And the first one is this emissions gap, right, which is all too familiar. And it's the gap between our current trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions and the one that we need to achieve in order to achieve international climate goals, right, in order to stabilize our climate in a place that's relatively safe. There's also a belief gap, is what I refer to it as, which is the gap between the percentage, and we're focusing certainly on American audiences, although these results, I think, translate very well to other English-speaking areas, but to an increasing extent, sadly, to other parts of the world as well. So a lot of the socio-political and cultural stuff that I'm going to be talking about is, more attuned to English-speaking audiences. But anyway, in the US, we've got this gap between the percentage of American public and the percentage of climate scientists who believe that climate change is real and caused by human activities. And there's quite a gap there. Also, in the US and many other parts of the world, there is increased politicization of climate change and increased polarization of this and other problems. So this is that third gap that I'm talking about, which is, in our country, at least in the US, it's a gap between Democrats and Republicans. In other countries, it may be a gap between the far right and, sort of mainstream or left views on climate change. So I think together, these gaps raise the question of how can we make progress on climate change, especially in democratic societies, if the public itself is divided and if public beliefs are poorly aligned with scientific knowledge. So, here again, this shows the percentage of registered voters who think climate change is mostly caused by human activities, divided by, in this country, by Democrats and Republicans. So just to kind of, give you, I think most of us in the SD world sit in a place where we're focused on information. And we spend a lot of time and energy trying to communicate about climate change to close these gaps. And we've certainly tried to do that by what we call the information deficit model, which basically says, if we provide people with, solid, rigorous, accessible information, they will learn and they will take action based on what they learn. And I'm sorry that red negative sign shouldn't be there right now, but you'll see as this builds. So, but we know after many, many years, starting with limits to growth, or maybe even earlier, this approach has not worked, right? So there are lots of reasons why this approach may be failing. One idea is that this stuff is just too complex, right? People don't understand feedbacks, delays, stock flow dynamics. They don't understand the quantum mechanics behind greenhouse gases. And, I could go on in any field you name, because climate change is so complex. So often with this issue of climate change and sustainability, they're coming to this with prior misconceptions, which sets up failure in many cases, because you're not talking about trying to fill in a blank slate. You're trying to first get rid of a misconception and then build new knowledge. And that's a real challenge. So that's another possibility. But I think that what we're really finding today is that a major problem is that oftentimes climate change itself, or even climate change solutions, threaten people's worldview or their social identity. And if that's the case, if you're in a situation where my social group doesn't agree about this problem, doesn't agree that this is a problem or that we should take these actions, now if you start to try to tell people something else, you've got a problem in that you're also threatening their social identity and they're belonging to a group. And so threatening one's connection to their worldview or their social group is something that we react to viscerally and take, and sort of actively push away. And that's really a problem. Another one is that, and I see this so often amongst my students, it honestly breaks my heart. It's this idea that, I can't do anything about this, right? That I don't have the agency to take action. Or in some cases, it's that I don't think my social group will act, so why should I act? So in other words, a low sense of self-efficacy or collective efficacy when it comes to climate change can thwart not just action, but also even learning about the problem. And so these are some of the things that we want to kind of look at. Can we overcome these problems, these barriers, through approaches that combine system dynamics models like C-roads and En-roads, but other ones too, like invitation out there to you all to bring this approach to your own SD modeling efforts. It doesn't have to be limited to C-roads and En-roads. And can we overcome some of these barriers? So I think I'll just lay out briefly a thesis that was put forward by Kahan et al., who referred to it as a cultural cognition thesis. I actually don't like that term, but I'll just lay out the kind of major thinking behind it. And really, it gets back at what are the social reasons and also perhaps emotional reasons that people push away climate change information and don't take action. So one is this, that, you know, if you have this cultural cognition thesis basically refers to identity protective motivated reasoning. In other words, I'm going to take motivated or biased reasoning based on a stance that protects my social identity, in which we unconsciously assimilate or reject new information in a way that reinforces our connections with our own social group. So if my social group doesn't view climate change as a threat, I should be predisposed to reject information that also indicates it's a threat. And we can actually measure, we like to refer to this thesis as socio-political worldview influence on climate change beliefs or whatever beliefs. And basically there's kind of two ends of the spectrum in terms of a scale on these socio-political worldviews. So one end of the spectrum would be communitarian, egalitarian people who have socio-political values that we would call communitarian, egalitarian. And these are people who value interdependence and they value equal status across gender, age, heritage, and ethnicity. And at the other end of the spectrum, whoops, we have, somehow I got lost in my slides. Sorry, it should say individualist hierarchs. And those are people who value freedom, competition, and clearly defined social hierarchies. I'm sorry, that should be at the bottom up there, but it's missing. And that would basically be another way to talk about these values, maybe more conservative and progressive. Generally, they map to that. So we basically ask this question: if we can take these people who are on opposite ends of this spectrum, from communitarian, egalitarian to individualistic, hierarchical, or progressive to conservative, and we know that they come to climate change with very differing views about it and beliefs and attitudes about it, and can we bring them more together and foster more effective problem solving against people with diverse sociopolitical, or amongst people with diverse sociopolitical views. So a few things that we sort of thought of as hopeful in terms of looking at these role play simulations that also include a system dynamics model. One is that prior research has shown that facilitated deliberation, or another word for that would be deliberative democracy, where there's a clear objective and people are working together to achieve a clear objective in a facilitated way that has, that involves deliberation, that can actually reduce polarization and foster effective problem solving. Our own prior research, which I'm going to share a couple of highlights from it in a moment, show that the world climate simulation that Carolyn mentioned enables people to learn and feel for themselves about climate change. So they have both a learning, a rational response where they're involving analytic processing, but also an emotional response. And that actually it's the emotional response more than the analytic processing that motivates science-based climate action. And in that case, we were very happy to find that those findings about motivating science-based action held for participants who have traditionally conservative views. In other words, those who oppose government regulation of free markets. And that was a preliminary finding that we wanted to explore more deeply. So just to kind of share the highlights from that work, we found that by participating in this interactive simulation with world climate, with both the SD model and the role play, delivered a gain in knowledge about climate change impacts. But it also, more importantly, delivered a related gain in a sense of urgency about climate change. So in other words, the more people learned about climate change impacts, the more they gained a sense of urgency about the problem. So this was an affective response, an emotional response that's grounded in knowledge. They also gained a sense of hope about the problem, not as much as urgency, but to some extent. And it actually was not the knowledge, but rather the sense of hope and urgency, and especially urgency, that drove an intent to take action in the real world. And so that was really interesting because, those of us who sit in the SD world, and certainly in science generally, and in academia generally, like to think that knowledge drives action. And that's not what our work showed, right? Our work showed that knowledge in this way, where it was constructed in a social environment with an emotional response, drove this emotional response. And it was that urgency, that emotion that drove intent to act. And it also drove a desire to learn more. So this new work that I'm just going to share with you today really asks this question about whether or not the sociopolitical worldviews that people come to these simulations with affect all of these things: knowledge, urgency, hope, and intent to take action about climate change, but also whether or not the simulation-based experience can influence the sociopolitical worldview and also influence these other things, regardless of sociopolitical worldview. And so just very briefly, we took a look at about 2,000 participants in the United States, because this is where this problem is really a big one, right? This Republican versus Democrat view on climate change. And we looked at results, pre and post surveys from 41 sessions that were held in the US. We measured people's sociopolitical worldview and also their gains in knowledge, urgency, and hope, and intent to take action. And what we found was pretty interesting. We actually were able to measure a shift from individualistic hierarchical worldview towards communitarian egalitarian. So there was a measurable, statistically significant shift amongst people who started off with a more individualistic hierarchical worldview towards the center. We didn't see the same shift from the communitarian egalitarian people. They kind of stayed where they were. And I'm certainly happy to share more details about that, but I don't want to spend too much time on it right now. So we also wanted to use general mixed models as an approach to test for interactions between worldview and learning impact. And in this case, we just divided our participants into 4 groups based on a median split in this scale from communitarian egalitarian to individualistic hierarchical. And so the 4 groups were those who began the simulation and ended the simulation with a more communitarian egalitarian worldview, those who began and ended with a more conservative or individualist hierarchical worldview, and then those who switched between them. So from IH to CE, from individualist hierarchical to communitarian egalitarian, or the other way. Whoops. Sorry, the other way would be from communitarian egalitarian to individualist hierarchical. So what do we find? Well, this graph shows the coefficients from the general mixed models showing the interactions between worldview and knowledge and climate change impacts from pre to post simulation. So here we're looking at, I think you can see my cursor, pre to post is where this is going. And let me just go back up for a second. Okay, so you can see then that here we've got the CE to CE, in other words, people who started and stayed communitarian egalitarian or more progressive. Then we've got the groups that switched, CE to IH and IH to CE. And then we've got the people who began and ended as in a more conservative or individualist hierarchical mode. So this is the beginning and the end of the simulation. So if we look at findings about knowledge, as we would expect based on what we know about climate change beliefs. So it turns out that in the US, at least, sociopolitical worldview is the strongest predictor for climate change beliefs. It's a stronger predictor than education. It's stronger than experience of climate disasters. If you know somebody's sociopolitical values, you have a pretty good chance you can predict their climate change beliefs. So as expected, those who started off with a more progressive or communitarian egalitarian worldview had higher knowledge and ended with higher knowledge. But we also see, compared to those that have a more individualist hierarchical worldview, but we also see that this group made gains. So they're also making statistically significant gains, even though they're starting and ending in a lower place than communitarian egalitarians. And those p-values are less than 0.0001, so that's exciting. And when we look then at what happens to the sense of urgency, here's the same graph, only now what we're looking at is how urgency changed. And what we find then is that worldview is correlated with urgency. Individualist hierarchs or IH participants start with the lowest level of urgency, and the communitarian egalitarians start with the highest. But what's really interesting here is that the greatest gains, and it was statistically significant, the greatest gains are actually made by those at the bottom. These guys are growing more than anybody else. So in other words, those who were individualist hierarchs actually had greater gains in urgency than any other group. And we see then with hope and intent kind of similar trends. The more conservative people have actually probably might think of it as sort of false hope. They have the highest levels of hope, but the lowest intent to take action. But again, here we're seeing greater gains in intent to take action amongst this group compared to other groups. Okay, so what do we take away from all this? Well, again, can't claim that we've solved this translation of knowledge to action necessarily, but I think what we can say is that we know sociopolitical worldview impacts climate change beliefs and attitudes in our sample and also in the general population in the US, so that's consistent with other research. But we also see evidence that simulated experiences, these what I call dual simulations, where we have a role play simulation and a physical technical system that's simulated through a system dynamics model or another model. So these simulated experiences can overcome social barriers to learning about climate change, and they can even shift people's worldviews, and they may help to depolarize climate change and foster productive decision making. So here again, some of the key features are to have a credible expert, have access to credible expert information, in this case, a system dynamics model, to give people a chance to learn for themselves, and to have a facilitated process through which they deliberate, to not have a messenger who's external, but rather to have a messenger who are the participants themselves, so they can develop a social identity that connects with that, and to have a shared objective. And then lastly, one of our kind of questions and interesting, something that we have evidence for from qualitative data is that people have a sense of simulated collective efficacy. So in other words, they're taking action that's not action in the real world, it's in a simulation, but that simulated action gives them a sense of having collective efficacy, which we know is one of the major drivers of social movements in the real world. So people who feel a sense of collective efficacy when they take action with other people are much more likely to do it again. And really that's what we need to address climate change, is collective knowledge and collective action. So I think that kind of gets us to our wrap up, which is, here we are, we're people who are passionate about our models, we're passionate about system dynamics, but we sort of have to ask ourselves, like, why is it that if limits to growth was so successful, we're still on that business as usual path based on the data in the empirical world, right? I mean, I hate to say it, but that's the truth. And so what do we need to do to move the real world? And I don't say that I have the answer, but I think we have to start with recognizing that social systems and the way people make decisions is critical. So, accessible, rigorous, and relevant models are necessary, but they're not sufficient. We need to understand how social interactions influence people's decision-making, as well as their emotional response. And reaching decision makers is necessary, but not sufficient. We need to reach many people. And I'll just also mention that we are currently engaged in a new project in collaboration with Climate Interactive and the MIT Sustainability Initiative called the Climate Pathways Project, in which we are investigating the impact of En-ROADS interactions on decision makers and hope to have more to report on that soon. I think, so yeah, our invitation to you is to take this kind of approach and run with it with your own work. And I'll just hand it back to Carolyn to wrap up.
Yeah, so just one last note on the collective knowledge and collective action. We were really excited to share some of our insights from our research around these SD tools and the associated simulations. We also have been funded by the National Science Foundation to develop curriculum around some of these tools for high school students. And so if you're interested in getting access to that or seeing if that might be relevant to some of your students, if you're an educator or whatever community groups, please do contact us. Our emails are here, and we're happy to share more about our research and some of this curriculum that we're developing around systems thinking, system dynamics, and climate change. So thank you so much for your attention and time.
Yeah, and also noting there's a bunch of questions in the poll everywhere. So thank you for all of those. Happy to answer those. I'm not sure what order we want to do that in, Fernando and Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you so much, Juliette. Thank you so much, Carolyn. We do have a lot of questions. I'm going to share my screen and try to moderate the Q&A. I would also like to invite Sandra Ham. She asked 2 questions in the chat, and I just asked her, as it's a little bit longer, her comment, so I'll just ask her to comment live. Sandra, are you here with us? Can you unmute yourself and just ask your 2 questions for Steve?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. They're very interesting. I am fairly new to SDS, so this is my first workshop here. I have 2 questions for Steve. First, are worldviews and values included in the iSDG models, and if so, how? And the second question relates to how the highest level decision makers regard the models. So I'm new to SDS, but spent a number of years working with a roughly analogous set of high-level objectives, the Healthy People Objectives in Public Health in the USA. Over the past 40 years, and especially in the past 15, many countries have adopted the US model for developing their own public health objectives, and they've grown to carry a lot of respect among high-level policymakers. Do you think that the iSDG models might be following a path similar to that of the Healthy People Objectives? If so, then it's a matter of time and familiarity in order for them to grow in their authority. Thank you.
You're muted, Steve.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Thank you for the question. And the first part of it, I think you asked me that if the ideals of the SDGs were included in the model. Is that correct?
Values. So values and worldviews that people hold, rather than the ideals of the SDG.
I don't know how to answer that really. I suppose it is in some kind of overall sense, but I can't think, that the model really identifies explicit targets and indicators that are specified in the SDGs by the UN and focuses on those things that we can, well, frankly, readily qualify in most instances. So I think perhaps it would come out more in the process of modeling versus the model itself, if that's an acceptable answer to you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I was thinking about things that might, say, maybe religious values that would influence how much people value consumption and economic activity, for example.
In that specific Malawi model, I don't think so in the model itself, but perhaps that's part of the background of actually going through the modeling process with the various partners that we had. And remind me of the second question.
Okay, the second question is about, let's see, I'll just ask it again. So over the past, I formerly worked for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the US, and I worked with Healthy People Objectives, which are public health objectives that are in the US. And over the past 15 years, they have been replicated in many other countries. And many other, the high-level decision makers related to public health in other countries regard Healthy People Objectives pretty highly. So I'm just wondering if you think that the iSDG models might be following a similar path and might eventually grow in their authority.
Well, I certainly hope so. I think that when we do these models and projects that typically last about 1 year. So there's a budget and we have to accomplish the model development and the interactions and this sort of thing and wrap up with a report. So we're actually serving two clients really. Is the country itself, maybe a national planning group, and the other people affiliated in terms of projects, the other people partnering with the project, and then the funding source or the UN agency that supports the project, and oftentimes is kind of the momentum or the initial thrust encouraging a government to take the approach. So I'm kind of chasing my own tail for the answer here, but I think that perhaps as far as spreading or using this model further across the world, I mean, sometimes I think there is communication between different governments. I think that happened in the case of Malawi and a recent project I was in Namibia, but mainly it's going to be through these international agencies, I think, that have partnerships ongoing with governments, where our engagement has tended to be more punctuated.
Okay.
I hope I answered you a little bit there.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to share my screen. We do have a lot of questions for all the presenters. So I can start with the most popular ones. We do have some direct questions, so we can also take those ones. I can start with this one if you don't mind. There's a lot of votes, so I think maybe everyone can, all the presenters can try to answer a little bit of these questions. How would you describe the interaction between complex models and simpler system dynamic models in more detail? How can they support each other? Who wants to take that? Sibel, maybe?
Yeah, let me come to that. I guess this refers to what I said in the presentation. I show the bilateral interaction between these two types of models. The first one is the support of complex models to simpler models. The second is the complementary support from simpler models to large complex models. So the first part of the relationship is mostly about validation, cross-validation of models. So cross-validation is when you build confidence in a model by comparing it to the output of another model. However, this doesn't mean that we just want to replicate what someone is replicating, because what someone else is producing, because that scenario projection produced by someone else is not the reality or best estimate, of course. Instead, cross-validation means that we look at the assumptions they make and the output they receive based on these assumptions, and we create a reasoning around it based on their assumptions and our assumptions. So this is one way of interaction from complex models to simpler models. Complex models help simpler models for confidence building and cross-validation. The other side of the relationship is the support from simpler models to complex models. And this is mostly about facilitating stakeholder engagement. Juliette talked a lot about engagement and how we can help people to understand the climate dynamics and decision-making better. So in that case, I'm talking more about the stakeholder engagement, who are people that involves people who will contribute to a policymaking process. not only everyone or public. So there, simpler models help to co-produce scenarios together with these stakeholders, create an understanding around these scenarios and the implications. And then later on, these scenarios can be simulated in detail by large detailed models, and the implications can be seen more accurately in a more detailed way. So shortly speaking, the complementary value of simpler models to large models is the power they have for stakeholder engagement and scenario co-production. I hope this helps.
Thank you, Sibel. I'll pick one question for Carolyn and Juliette. There is, as Steve and Sibel has already answered one, there's this question here that do you guys have any tips on how to engage kids with these tools? Tools, I assume it's system dynamics models.
Yeah, so as Carolyn mentioned, we have developed curriculum and are developing more curriculum around En-ROADS, but also around C-ROADS that's freely available. So we know these tools really work with kids. We've used C-ROADS and World Climate with kids as young as 5th grade, 4th grade, so kind of like 10, 11 years old. And the En-ROADS tools, I think, are a little bit more complex, but we're working on a high school level set of curriculum for that. And yeah, kids hop right into this and do a great job. So I think so far our evidence suggests that they work well and the role plays go really well. They're also, you can develop assignments or projects around them. And I would encourage you to check out our website. Happy to share that in the chat, where you can find more information, as well as Climate Interactive's website. Carolyn, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add.
Yeah, I'll just also add that depending on the level or where students are coming from, it's important to make sure that they really know what roles they're representing. So provide some scaffolding about who they're representing and some time to get into that role. And then also what we've shared is our research shows all of these different emotional impacts. So make sure if you're working with kids to leave a good amount of space for a debrief after the simulation as well, so that they can talk about that and talk about what they want to do next.
That's great. We are approaching our time, but I'll kindly ask all the presenters to stay a little bit more. We do have a lot of questions, so if you could take maybe a few more, that would be great. This is done. Steve, are there any parts of the iSDG model publicly available?
The answer is yes. You can go to our website, millennium-institute.org, and in fact, you can access or you can download the model that I demonstrated during my talk and use it yourself. There's also some videos online and the model's documentation, which is pretty extensive. It's all there to be seen. And so that is one way for sure to do that.
Thanks, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. This is my question, actually. What are the similarities between the En-ROADS model and the iSDG model? And what are the main differences? Do you guys ever work together?
No, we haven't. We haven't done any joint projects together. I think one of the important differences, I think, is that En-ROADS is correct me if I'm wrong, Sibel, is a global model. It takes the entire world, where the iSDG model is focused typically on a country, sometimes at a county level or regional level, and it's customized for that limited geography.
Do you want to add on that, Sibel?
Yeah, so this is the main difference that I can see, because En-ROADS is a global model. Even though we have regional projections in the background. We don't show many of them to the outside world, but some calculations under the hood are regional, and then we aggregate them to the global level and report accordingly. However, En-ROADS has never been producing scenarios for a single country like iSDG model is doing. So this is and it's not a plan to produce, as far as I know, such national outcomes for a single country or particular country. So this is the main difference I see. It's also different in terms of the scope. I don't remember exactly which of the SDGs that Millennium Institute's model is addressing, but if it addresses all of the SDGs, this is definitely not the scope of En-ROADS, because En-ROADS is more focused on climate change, energy system, and coming is the more like nature and land sector. So in that sense, it doesn't have the scope the iSDG model has.
Thank you. This is done. I'm just going to scroll down. Maybe you guys want to take a specific question. There are some here, very popular ones, but maybe you guys want to see if there's any question you'd like to answer. But when I'm scrolling down, there's a lot of questions to Juliette here. The ones that you presented last, Juliette. So these questions are here at the bottom. Maybe this one. Could you say a bit more about hope?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think so. This is a really interesting question because certainly for those of us who are tuned in to the climate change communication literature and kind of like what communication experts advise us in terms of how to communicate about climate change, we hear a lot about like, don't make people anxious, don't make them scared, focus on hope, focus on the things that are positive and solution oriented. And I totally relate to that. I mean, especially as a teacher of young, educator who works with young people, I definitely want to instill hope in them. But what our own data show is that when it's intrinsically generated, actually hope is less important than urgency in terms of driving action. So I don't think that I could tell somebody how to feel, like to say, I wouldn't want to say like, you should be afraid of climate change. Like that's not going to go anywhere. That's not going to get me far. But if they come to that feeling themselves, and anxiety, I think would be part of that sense of urgency is also connected to a sense of anxiety. So if they come to that and it's intrinsically generated, then that actually is much more likely to drive action than a sense of hope. And with the political divide in the US, you saw perhaps, I know I went through it quickly, but you might have seen that the individualist hierarchs had a higher level of hope than the people who actually knew more and wanted to do more about climate change. And in that case, I don't know for sure, but there is this idea of kind of false hope about climate change, where there's hope that there's real hope that really maybe we could see collective action and move towards real solutions. But then there's also this kind of like false hope of, well, it's not going to take that much to get this problem solved. And so I feel pretty hopeful about it. And so we didn't distinguish between those two things in our analysis, so I can't speak to that from our own data. But that's my sense, is that most likely we saw that difference between the more conservative and progressive groups because of probably a sense of not hope that's maybe not grounded in reality. And I know, of course, we didn't measure that. I can't say for sure, but that's just our own guess. Our own guess.
Thank you, Juliette. It was actually me who asked this question, and I formulated it before you showed the graphs about hope. And maybe a question is not really about hope, but more about anxiety, because there is definitely a growing anxiety in the population. Yeah. So what would be your recommendation on an individual basis? Would role play games really help to deal with this anxiety? And
yeah, that's a great question. I think so. Here's the thing. the trick is that, so I don't know, for those of you who have played World Climate, you may know that it can be pretty depressing, right? Like it basically immerses you in the tragedy of the common system. And if you don't get to a solution, if you don't overcome that, usually what happens is people transition from tragedy of the commons to kind of a coordination game, which is sort of like what happened in Paris, right? It was this realization that we're all going to go down together if we don't take action together, and therefore we should take action together. So if people don't get to that place, then it can really be a downer, and it can also, not deliver that sense of collective efficacy, right? We know from the sociological research on social movements that if people engage in social movements and they get a small win, something works out, then they have a sense of collective efficacy and they're willing to go back and do more. But if they don't have that, they may just feel like giving up. So I think the real thing that I try to do as a facilitator is to I don't want to go into it. I want to make sure people open their eyes. I don't want to sugarcoat anything. I don't try to pretend that it's all going to be okay. But I also want to give people a sense that if they do work together, they can achieve a positive outcome. And that's really, I think, what that role of, it's okay to have anxiety if you also have a sense that a solution is possible. And in my head, systems thinking, we also often talk about the rubber band analogy, which you may be familiar with. In my head, I have this image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in my head, where he's looking through the bars of that jail, and he's in jail. His eyes are open to the sort of awful reality that would come with this anxiety, but he also has hope, right? He also has a vision, a dream of the future. And it's holding both of those things together that can drive action.
Thank you, Juliette. Maybe a final question, so we can take, I'm sorry, guys, there's a lot of unanswered questions, but I'll share this Q&A with the presenters, and hopefully they can send back to me, and we can post on a blog as we usually do. So if your question was not answered here live, watch out for them, keep an eye on the blog, Wisdom blog, and you can see your question answered there. Maybe final question, I'll take one from the most popular ones to you, Sibel. What are some of the major impacts that the Climate Interactive team see on the application side of the models?
This question is unfortunately not very clear to me. Can someone help? So application side of the models, do you mean the development process or the use of these models? If the person who asked the question here,
if the person, yeah, I don't have her or his name. Do you want to try answer this one then? Why don't you use Python as the
that's an easy
language?
one. That's an easy one. We don't use Python because Python is a more kind of late programming language that is very accessible, very easy to code, but it doesn't have the computational advantage of more primitive programming languages as C. Therefore, it's not as fast as C. So that's one reason that the Vensim code is translated into C.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sibel. Is there any other question that Steve, Carolyn, Juliette, or you, Sibel, do you want to take any final question here that you see you'd like to address? Really the final one. Maybe this one. Steve's question regarding connecting real action to the plan is important. How do we make the interactive modeling tools an integral part of follow-up and feedback on action? This is a very good question, I think. Not only for Steve, I think for all of you who presented today.
It's a great question. It's a very thought-provoking question. I can't say that I have a complete answer to it. I think that the one thing we try to do at the Millennium Institute is we try to remain connected with the people we work with. When the project's finished, we try not to just turn to the next thing and forget it, but try to keep a line of communications going. I mentioned in my talk that, in fact, the people in Malawi have contacted us again about helping with some modeling for the Africa 2063 vision, and we did some simulations with them on that. So that's not the answer to that question, but I think at least for us, since we're focused on one country and a rather specific set of partners, I think this idea of continuing in communication is very important. I'll let the others turn to this one.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Steve, I think that it is a really thought-provoking question, and I think a really key question to ask is, in terms of feedback on action, who are those decision makers answering to, and what feedback on action will they respond to, right? And that's something that I think is not necessarily obvious sometimes. I mean, certainly we think that part of that is part of who they're answering to, the feedback that they would answer to is the public or is their constituents, perhaps it's lobbyists, but that's such an important thing to think about, because if you don't reach the people whose feedback they will respond to, then you're going to have a problem, right? And you alluded to that, Steve, earlier in terms of reaching the decision makers that are key, but then also, who are those decision makers answering to, and can you reach those people as well? And it's not easy, right? These are not easy things to do. This is a lot of work, but it seems like if we don't do it, if we don't sort of think about the complexity of those social systems, we're not going to achieve the outcomes we want.
Thank you so much, Juliette. Do you have any final considerations, Sibel? Do you want to say anything on this question?
No, but I would like to thank to you, Fernando, and to the society for inviting us for this very interesting webinar.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us.
And Juliette.
This was really great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and not all the presenters, but also the audience who are here all the time. That makes me very happy to see returning faces, but also new faces. And we try to cover different areas inside system dynamics. So it's truly great to see the audience replying and answer this for this webinars. This is truly great for me. Just one last reminder about this free upcoming webinar on August 18. You can go to systemdynamics.org/seminar series and register for this webinar, and also invite all your friends to sign up. There's limited space, so go ahead and sign up for that. And please help us to improve. Oh, sorry, I'm presenting in a weird way. Help us to improve. You can check your email. There's going to be a link for the survey that we usually send out after the webinar, but also I think Puri is putting this in the chat. If you could just click there, you'll be led to the survey. Well, thank you so much again, Juliette, Carolyn, Sibel, and Steve. This was truly great for me. And thank you everyone for coming. I really hope to see you at the conference now, and then in August again here. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.